Yes, we regularly ask, well, if everything got off the ark or all the animals got off the ark, how did the kangaroo get to Australia? How come Australia has such unique and strange
Mm.
creatures? Surely they evolved here simply because Australia is at the back end of the earth, and so creatures must have evolved here because that's why they're so different. So you've got two very, very different worldviews in terms of how animals got to the different places they are all over the world. Um, but the Bible clearly tells us that all the air breathing, land dwelling animals have only survived on earth because they were on Noah's Ark. And we're told where Noah's Ark ended up landing in the Middle East. So, how did they get all over the world? So, I've just got a little brief summary here of some of the issues, particularly relating to Australia, but of course it's a bigger topic than that. So we do welcome questions about animals and plants all over the world. Craig's going to tell us some really interesting stuff about Australian plants. Well, this was a question that was sent in to the Ask John Mackay website, which is our question and answer site. This was sent quite a while ago, but the site is still going and still open for questions. If you do have any, have a look through it. And if there are any questions that you have we haven't answered, there are several hundred questions there. You can send them in on the site itself. But this was one that came in. How did animals populate the world after the flood? And it was asked particularly in the context of Australian animals, which are a bit different to animals in the rest of the world. Surely they must have evolved here. But of course, every continent and every area has its unique animals. And these are generally described as being indigenous. In other words, that they evolved here, and that's why we need to protect them. Um, and that's used as evidence for evolution. Well, let's just consider the big picture of the distribution of animals after the flood. Uh, it's interesting that people multiplied after the flood, but they didn't leave the Middle East for probably around 100 years, but certainly until the time of the Tower of Babel, whereas animals and birds would have started dispersing straight away. And that's probably a good thing in terms of the people were just as sinful after they got off the ark and started multiplying and defying God, just like people did before the flood. And when you only had small groups of animals, it's quite possible they could have killed off quite a number of the animals. But anyway, animals and birds would have started dispersing straight away. And we need to consider what the world was like. Um, Immediately after the flood, it would have been a lush green world because the ground was still wet. Remember, Noah had to wait in the ark until the ground was sort of firm enough and dry enough for things to live on the earth, and presumably for the vegetation to grow, so that the animals would have food. But the ground would have still been moist, and there would have been a lot of newly sprouted vegetation, but there wouldn't have been the sort of thick, very dense jungles, and there wouldn't have been deserts, which are a barrier to migrating animals these days. And there is evidence for that. There's evidence that incredibly arid places like the Arabian Peninsula, like the inland of Australia, which are incredibly dry now, uh, they were once lush places with trees and rivers. So no one disputes that. They just dispute the timing involved, but they don't dispute the fact that in the past these were much wetter and lusher places. So the environment would have been much better for animals to migrate around the world on land than it is now. There wouldn't have been quite so many barriers. Um, so that's good for big mobile animals that can move by themselves. Certainly no problem for flying animals. So birds would have had no trouble dispersing all over the world. Uh, but what about small, slow animals? Because critics say, well, you know, there are small, slow invertebrates, some of which are flightless. How could they have ended up being dispersed all over the world. Uh, well, actually, Darwin made an interesting suggestion relating to snails. Now, there is a very slow land-bound animal. How did they spread out all over the world? Well, Darwin actually had a suggestion that birds could have carried them, and we certainly know that birds can carry invertebrate eggs and small invertebrates themselves on their feet and carry them all over the world. Darwin particularly made um, a point about snails hitching a lift with birds. And there was a study done back in 2006 of the genetics of a particular snail. Um, and they found that this particular land snail existed in all the way from the North Atlantic to the South Atlantic on different islands. So it's found in Europe, the Azores, which is sort of somewhere off the mid-Atlantic there, off about the level of Spain, and the Tristan da Cunha Islands, which are way down in the South Atlantic. And they looked at the genetics of these snails and decided, well, they are all one group of very closely related species. um, they had to be transported by some way that the snails certainly didn't swim all the way from north to south. Uh, as an article in Nature News there in 2006, that was their headline, "The Tale of the Flying Snail." And now, if you are interested in how snails got all around the world, we have another question on the Ask site as well. How did snails survive Noah's flood? How did all the species spread all around the world? And we have a friend and supporter named Simon Terry who is an expert in snails and slugs. And in fact, he uses them to teach people about creation. And so he's written a very interesting article, which you can also find on the Ask John Mackay site. But let's go back to Australian animals. Australian marsupials are well known Australian animals. Lesser known are the monotremes, which are the platypus and the echidna. Really interesting, unique animals that the evolutionists can't really explain how they got to evolve, but that's another whole issue. How did they get to Australia? It's a very long way from the Middle East, and there is a problem in that there's a fair bit of ocean involved in in going from the Middle East to Australia. They are certainly too big to be carried by birds, and they're not very good at swimming. However, they didn't need to swim, but they still did get there by themselves because we know that after the flood, the continents as we know them were basically in place. But following that, there were periods where the sea levels dropped, particularly in the ice ages. Now, there's good evidence for this in both human habitation and in um, rivers that are under the sea now. We can see where they've been. So no one disputes that the sea levels have dropped by a long way. And so once upon a time, or once during this time, no fairy tales here, right? There were places which are now under the sea where people lived, where animals lived and bred, and could have easily migrated. And so during this time, there would have been land bridges for animals to migrate. Now, we did mention this when we looked at the issue of people migrating all over the world as well. So in terms of getting to Australia, if the sea levels were dropped down to just the edges of what are now called the continental shelves, an awful lot of ocean ends up being being emerged over onto the surface. So it's quite possible that migration routes from Southeast Asia and Australia were opened up, and the gaps between, even where the islands weren't completely connected, would have been a lot shorter. And the other thing we need to remember is that marsupials are not actually unique to Australia. They're also found in North, Central, and South America, but they also could have crossed into the Americas from the Middle East by a region that is called Beringia, which is now at the bottom of the sea in the Bering Straits. But again, there is good evidence that people and animals actually lived on what is now the bottom of the sea. And I don't know whether you have any of these around your area, Glenn, the American opossum. They look like a rather nice, cute creature. I've never actually seen one. Uh,
Yes, we definitely have them. They're quite common around here. I don't know about the cute part, but they're very common. I'm sure I've got them in my yard.
They're not like your
yeah,
American Australian possums. The Australian possums are lovely.
They're,
Yeah.
yes, they're quite. However, everyone thinks the koala is cute. Actually, they have quite a grumpy temperament as well. Um, but but anyway, let's go back to the Australian. So marsupials and monotremes, which are the echidna and the platypus, could have arrived by land bridges. That's quite easily explained there. Now, when the sea levels rose again, of course, they became isolated. Uh, but because they were suited to the environment and they were able to cope with the environmental changes, and there are parts of Australia which are, of course, quite green and lush. Not all of Australia is a barren desert like you have round in central Australia. Uh, they survived here. Now, keep that in mind. We'll come back to that. They didn't evolve here, but they moved here and then they survived. But just a couple of other interesting things. There are other options for ocean crossings, and we actually observe these going on today. Now, the other thing Australia is well known for are crocodiles. Apparently, crocodile stories get into the news all over the world. I remember staying with some friends in the UK, and there was a crocodile story on the BBC. And so when I was introduced to one of their neighbours, they said, "Oh, we know about Australia. Your country is lethal. You have crocodiles and all sorts of other dreadful things there." Now, this particular crocodile, known as the estuarine crocodile, they're also known as saltwater crocodiles or sea-growing crocodiles because they live in the river estuaries rather than inland in the freshwater rivers, and they are actually observed to go out into the sea. And so a group of scientists decided to track these and see how far they could move. And it's interesting, this study was done quite a few years ago, and one of the people involved was Steve Irwin, who has since passed away, of course. And they found that crocodiles could actually use surface water currents, tidal currents, and they could travel very long distances. And they were just tracking these around northern Australia, and they did find that some of them could start off on the east coast of Cape York, which is the sort of large pointed bit on the northern part of Australia, go all the way through the Torres Strait and end up hundreds of miles down the west coast. So they tracked the crocodiles for quite long distances, and they found that they were using surface water currents. And there is plenty of anecdotal evidence of crocodiles being seen quite far out to sea. And so this was their conclusion, that their study demonstrated that this particular crocodile dramatically increased their travel potential by riding surface currents, providing an effective dispersal strategy for this species. Now, the reason that they wanted to do this study is that this same species is found throughout Southeast Asia. And there were questions, well, how could they possibly have spread throughout Southeast Asia when there's so much ocean between the Southeast Asian island countries and Australia? Now, another observation that has been made in recent times is about green iguanas. And these were observed to arrive for the first time on a Caribbean island named Anguilla in the 1990s. And so some scientists carried out a study of these, and they looked at the weather in the Caribbean, and they found that when there were a lot of storms, and particularly hurricanes, but just bad storms, where you get a lot of debris and mats of vegetation being ripped up and then floating in the ocean. Is it possible for these rafts, as it were, to carry small animals? And sure enough, they found that iguanas were quite good at raft riding. And this was the conclusion that they came up with. Observations confirmed that raft dispersal can occur successfully, and which meant that overwater dispersal of large vertebrates, and in other words, they're too large to be carried by birds or by other flying creatures. They had to get there on their own, but they could ride rafts of just vegetation that's been ripped up. Well, after Noah's flood, there was probably quite a lot of mats of vegetation and debris floating around, and there would have been storms and all sorts of other weather events as the environment settled down. So this would explain how a lot of mobile, particularly reptiles, which can go quite long times without having to feed, and they can go into a sort of estivation, a type of dormancy. They could get a free trip over quite long distances in oceans by just riding on rafts. So post-flood animal distribution all over the world is not a problem if you take into account, well, things that could fly. They can carry hitchhikers of small animals. There were land bridges during part of the post-flood time. Some animals can actually cross the oceans in their own right, like the crocodiles, and others can take advantages of things like floating rafts and other floating vegetation. So if we go back to this whole idea of supposed indigenous animals, we can explain why you have unique animals in different parts of the world. They did not evolve where they live now, right? The reason that they live in different parts of the world is because this is where they survived. In other words, this is a clear example of survival of the fittest. That is a real process. Now, survival of the fittest is also known as natural selection. That is also a real process, but it's not evolution. To select something means to be able to choose between already existing examples. So what's happened in the spread of animals around the world and why we have different animals in different continents and different regions is because that's where they ended up and that's where they could survive. That's where they could carry on in spite of environmental changes, where they found an environment that suited them. So a lot of the processes that are supposedly evolutionary processes are nothing of the sort. But they are real biological processes. They won't explain how animals change from one thing to another. They just explain how things survived. And Craig has a wonderful example about another iconic Australian life form, and that's eucalyptus trees.